video is my summer 2020 book recommendations. Now, just a forewarning, this is not necessarily recommendations of books that have come out in 2020. Some of them maybe came out in 2020, a few of them came out last year. Some of them are also pretty old. But when I was going through my books, I was thinking about the fact that in this time, with this crazy pandemic that's going on, people are looking for escapism, which is the biggest reason why I read, because I love to be thrown into different worlds and different places and meet these new characters, and it kind of helps me forget about everything that's been going on right now. So I compiled a list of books that I think are great books for escapism. They come from all different types of genres, from historical fiction to fantasy, sci-fi. I've got some young adults thrown in. So if you are interested in seeing some awesome, highly recommended books that you can read this summer to help get through this crazy time, then just keep watching. The first book that I'm going to start off with is, I guess you could call it historical fiction. It came out a long time ago. I can't remember the exact year, but I know I was a freshman in high school when I first read it, and I'm 28 years old now, so it was a long time ago. But it is one of my favorite books. It was one of my favorite books until just recently, but it is Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. This is about the building of a cathedral in like the 1300s. And that sounds pretty lame, if I'm being honest. When I was first gifted this book for my birthday, I read the insert and I was like, I don't want to read a book about somebody building a cathedral, but I sped through this book. It immersed me into this world. I love historical fiction. And you really meet these characters that you grow to love and hate. And the character development is amazing. The story is amazing. To be honest, there's not a ton about like the actual cathedral. Really, it centers around the lives of these characters as they're living in this town and this life in the 1300s, which is way different from the life we have now. So if you're interested in kind of getting away and experiencing something that's in a different time period, and also really growing to love some characters, some fictional characters, then I highly recommend this book to you. It's a big guy, but it is totally worth the read, and you will get sucked into the story in like the very first chapter. So highly recommend Pillars of the Earth. The next book is also historical fiction, and this came out a while ago as well. There is a movie that had, I think it was Natalie Portman in it, and she did a great job, but it's The Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory. Philippa Gregory writes some great historical fiction books, so if you are a historical fiction buff, definitely check out more of her books. This takes place in like the 1500s with King Henry VIII. He's the guy that went through like 8 different wives. And it's just a really fascinating story. It's told from the point of view of the other Boleyn girl, which is Anne Boleyn's sister. And if you don't know who those people are, that's okay. You will quickly learn as you read this book. But it's just full of great like courtly intrigue, romance, drama, gossip, all the things that we humans love. So again, another great read. Takes place in a different time period, different expectations for women and men and society. So I just love learning about this time period in particular because it's so different from the way that we live today. And again, another great book if you're looking to escape the world that we're living in right now. So Philippa Gregory, The Other Boleyn Girl. The next few books I'm going to talk about are more of lighter reads, some romance, some drama books, but they're not very long. They don't require a ton of thought process. Some people, when they read, they don't like to have to think about everything that's going on and put all the puzzle pieces together. sometimes we just like a light read. Doesn't require a lot of brain power. Bubble gum for your brain is what I like to call it. So this first one is one of my favorite books of all time. It's called Firefly Lane by Kristen Hanna. Mine is pretty beat up because I've read it many times. The back cover is completely gone. I have no idea where it's at, but this is such a great book about female friendship. You follow the lives of these two girls growing up in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and you just follow these characters as they grow and develop and they build families, and there's just a lot of great themes in this book. I love it so much. This is one of the only books that can make me cry. It's just a great drama. It's really funny. You really connect to these characters, both of them. It follows two girls. Both of them are so different, but you love each of them for your own different reasons. And it's just like a heartwarming, just such a great read. I love this book so much. Highly, highly recommend Firefly Lane. The next book is The Friend Zone by Abby Jimenez. I hope I'm saying that right. This is a newer romance book, and I really liked it. It was a really quick read for me. I really liked the characters. I really liked the romance. It's not the kind of romance book where there's a bunch of really steamy sex scenes going on. I typically don't like those kinds of books. I'll skip over those parts. There's not a lot of that going on. It's more about the romantic part of it and the building up between these two characters to their romance, which I really enjoy personally. And it actually has a sequel called The Happy Ever After Playlist, and this one was even better, in my opinion, than this first one. You still need to read the first one because you get a lot of background on the characters, and it's still great. But this one was just amazing, and it made me laugh, it made me cry. Again, it was another quick read. You get sucked in, you learn to love these characters. So definitely heartfelt books. If you're into the kind of romance and you're not a big steamy sex fan and you like to laugh a lot, these are the books that you want to get into. The next books I don't actually have physical copies of. They are on my Nook. But the next book I'm going to talk about is The Tea Rose by Jennifer Donnelly. Sorry if you see me looking down, it's because I wrote down a list. It's called The Tea Rose by Jennifer Donnelly. And again, it takes place in kind of a different time period. It takes place in, I think it's like the late 1800s, maybe early 1900s. And you follow this female protagonist. She initially starts out in England and she's poor. She, her family doesn't have a lot of money. And she has this huge dream of owning a tea shop. And you just kind of follow her journey. You've got a love interest. You've also got kind of a storyline with Jack the Ripper in it, which I like because I'm also a big fan of some gruesome, gory things in books too. It's not too gory, but it does have like a suspense theme throughout it as well. And it also follows like her journey to America and becoming like an independent businesswoman in a time period when women weren't really allowed to have businesses. There were a lot of restrictions on women, and it's just a really great tale. It's got comedy, it's got drama, it's got suspense. It's set again in a different time period. It's not so much historical fiction, it's more of a drama. But again, it's a great book if you're looking for escapism. The other book that I want to talk about, the last book kind of in this genre category, I also don't have, it's on my Nook, and it's called Letters to the Lost. And this isn't such a light read. It's more of a drama, but it's also extremely heartfelt. Like, it is going to hit you in the feels if you read this book. Basically, you're following a female and a male protagonist, and I don't want to give too much away, but they start writing letters to each other at a cemetery. That doesn't sound great. That doesn't make it sound as good as it is, but basically one of them finds a letter on a grave that was written for the person in that grave, and he starts responding to those letters, and they start writing to each other, and you really get to know the characters through their letters, and you get to know their stories, and there's like a way that it's all interconnected and a twist at the end. So that's another good book. It definitely is not a lighthearted read, but it also doesn't require you to think that much. So that's kind of why I grouped it in with this genre. The next book, I also don't have a physical copy of. It is on my Nook as well, but this is in the thriller category. And the kind of thrillers that I like to read are, you get the mystery and the suspense in there, but then you also have like some sort of crazy plot line, and it's got serial killers and, you know, all the good stuff. A lot of people are into more of the suspense. I like more of like the murder and the mystery and solving things and, you know, a typical thriller. And so my favorite author in general for thriller books is Karin Slaughter. Her last name is Slaughter, like slaughtering pigs. I'm pretty sure that's not her real name, but it is the perfect name for her based on the books that she writes. One of my favorite books by her is called Pretty Girls, but her books are not for the faint of heart. Like, she gets into storylines that make my stomach hurt because they're so disgusting and gory and out there, but in a really good way. If you do not like that kind of stuff, and if you're not a big fan of like true crime or serial killers and the specific details about what serial killers do to their victims, then you won't like her books. I mean, she gets down and dirty, and they're just really good. There's a lot of mystery, you get that suspense, but she's pretty gory about it, if I'm being honest. But I like those kinds of thrillers. She has quite a few series that are very similar writing style, in that she takes it to the extreme. But I highly recommend any of her books. I would start with Pretty Girls if you're going to get into Karin Slaughter books, because that is a standalone and it's a perfect representation of her types of stories, and that way you can get an idea of if you actually like it or not. If you don't like being stressed out, because I know we're talking about escapism from the kind of crazy world that we're living in right now, so if you don't want to read a book that stresses you out, I'm not sure you should read this, because it does kind of stress you out. It is that mystery thriller suspense. But Pretty Girls by Karin Slaughter is a really good book if you're looking for a thriller. The next genre that I'm going to look at is science fiction. So one thing to know about me, and I guess you can kind of see the books on my bookshelf, but I'm a huge fantasy and sci-fi nerd. Those are my favorite types of books. So I've got quite a few of those recommendations in here that I'll be talking about. But I'd have to say that my all-time favorite science fiction series right now, could always change, but my all-time favorite science fiction series right now is Red Rising by Pierce Brown. I bought this years and years ago. I think when it first came out, before it became a really big deal in the sci-fi book community. I bought it at the beach. I was looking for just a beach read. I had no idea what it was about. I was just intrigued by it. It's his first book that he's ever written. And it follows this character in a world where your social class is based on your color. So there's a social order. You've got like golds at the top, then silvers, then bronze, copper, you've got blues, obsidians, oranges, reds, and it's not a very good social class system, because of course you'd have the people at the top taking advantage of the people at the bottom and forcing them to labor away and live these horrible lives. And so the main character is in one of the lower castes in this society, And he basically wants to overthrow this corrupt social class system. And he does that by basically becoming a spy in the top social caste. And I don't want to tell you how or anything like that because I don't want to ruin it. But it's basically a revolutionary story set in a completely different world. It's set in space. They have all these different planets that they're colonizing. The technology and the descriptions of the battles and things like that. It's just really awesome. If you're somebody that likes to watch sci-fi, but you've never tried reading it, I would start with this series because it's a really good intro series to sci-fi, and his writing is really great. It is a trilogy, and then he is coming out with another trilogy on top of that based on like the same characters in the same world. I haven't started reading. He's got 2 books out in the second trilogy. I haven't started reading that, but he does wrap up the main story. He does have 3 books that wrap up the main story. So if you're interested in a sci-fi series and you haven't really read sci-fi before, or you're just looking for something good to read that kind of takes you out of this world and puts you in a new one, recommend Red Rising by Pierce Brown. It's a great story. The next book is actually a standalone fantasy book. There's not a lot of standalone fantasy books. Most fantasy, whether it's YA fantasy, adult fantasy, most of it typically comes in a series, which honestly makes it the book better because then you have this buildup of characters, you have the buildup of the world, the plot, so you don't typically find a lot of standalone fantasy books. But one of my all-time favorite standalone fantasy books is called The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. Now, she also has a YA fantasy trilogy. I haven't read that yet. This is the only book of hers that I've read. It's gorgeous. Look at that color. I love this cover so much. And it's a really epic fantasy story. It's got dragons, it's got dragon riders, it's got different kingdoms, it's got this evil that's being born again, that's going to destroy the world, good versus bad, your typical tropes that you'll find in an epic fantasy series. But the good thing about this is it's not a series, it's just a standalone, and you still get all of those awesome things in this one book. Now, again, it's a whopper of a book, it's pretty big, but I like big books because that means it takes you longer to read, you spend more time in this world, you get to know these characters really well. So it's a really great read. It's definitely something you should read if you're interested in dragons and kingdoms and politics and things like that. So Priory of the Orange Tree is a great read. The next one is a relatively new fantasy series. I think it came out in 2019. It's the first book in this series, and I think it's the first book that this author has written, but I was blown away when I read it, and that is The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. I know a lot of people, especially on the Fantasy BookTube, are talking about this book, but it really is amazing. This is another book that's got dragons in it. It's got such an intriguing world and such an intriguing magic system. It really pulls you in. It's just super duper interesting. I don't know when he's coming out with the second one, but the first one was just a great read. And again, if you like being transported into different worlds, different time periods with these amazing characters, crazy magic systems that you could never even dream of, this is a great book for you. The next book, this is an epic fantasy series. The series has been fully completed. So if you're looking to read an epic fantasy or a high fantasy series, but you don't want to have to wait for books to come out in the series, which I hate doing, especially if it's a really good series, then you'll like this because this series is complete. It's high fantasy. It's absolutely amazing, one of my favorite series of all times, and it's the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks. This one is the very first book in the series. It's got 5 books in it. They are pretty hefty as well, but totally worth it. The magic system is probably one of the most unique magic systems that I've ever read in a fantasy book. It's based around the different colors of light, which, you know, I had my eye on this series for years, but I never ended up reading it until last year because the premise didn't sound interesting to me. A magic system based on different colors of light. What can you even do with that? Like, what kind of magic is that? What can you do with light? So I always kept putting it back down because I was like, I'm just not interested. And one day I picked it up and I started reading it, and it's one of my favorite magic systems. I know it sounds crazy having a magic system based around light, but he does such an amazing job with it. You will love this magic system. You will love this world. I wish I could live in this world. That's how much I love it. You will love the characters. They have such a great amount of growth and development through this entire storyline. It's such a good epic fantasy series. I will say I was a little disappointed by the last book, which just came out last year. It didn't wrap up quite the way I wanted it to, but still worth the read. So if you're looking for a long, high fantasy series with an awesome magic system, and awesome characters, an awesome world, lots of fighting and war, this is definitely a series for you. So go check that out for sure. The next high fantasy or epic fantasy series that I would recommend is also fully completed. It's a trilogy, and it is the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. If you are a fantasy nerd like me, you know that Brandon Sanderson is a pretty big name in the fantasy community. He writes a lot of adult fantasies. His Stormlight Archive series, which I have right here, is one of the all-time best-selling fantasy series out there, I believe. But I wouldn't start, if you're new to Brandon Sanderson, I would not start with the Stormlight Archives. I would start with Mistborn. It's a trilogy. And again, this magic system, similar to the Lightbringer series that I just mentioned, this magic system is so unique and interesting. This magic system is based off of metals and these different powers that you can have if you consume different metals and you burn them, and it gives you all kinds of crazy powers depending on which metal you burn or which metal you ingest, which sounds weird, but it makes total sense in these books. And out of every book I've ever read, every fantasy series I've ever read, which is a lot, I will say that the way Brandon Sanderson wraps up this series in the final book is the most perfect wrap up I have ever read. It wraps up every storyline, it wraps up every plot, it ties everything together in this most perfect way. I had just never read anything that came together so amazingly as the final book in this series. I love fantasy series, but there's a lot of problems with endings in fantasy series because you build up these worlds and these characters throughout this series, and then you get to the end and it's like, how do you wrap it up in this epic, amazing way? And Brandon Sanderson, especially in this trilogy, did that so perfectly. My mind was blown when I finished the last book. I even bought the special edition right here, which is quite expensive, but this is the last book, and it's such a great series. So I highly recommend this one as well. The next book is new this year. It came out in March. It is Crescent City by Sarah J. Maas. It's the first book in her new series, The House of Earth and Blood. I am going to say that Sarah J. Maas is my all-time favorite author. She, before this book, only wrote YA fantasy series. This is considered new adult, and this is actually in the urban fantasy category. So if you're looking for an urban fantasy where there's still themes from kind of our world in it, but then it also has fantastical elements, then this would be a really good book. I love Sarah J. Maas. I love her writing. I know there are some people out there that don't, but I would definitely give it a shot. I will say it took me probably 200 pages before I really got into the story. She does a lot of world building at the beginning, and it's kind of confusing, but everything starts to come together after that, and the storyline is great. There is a lot of romance in here, not necessarily like steamy scenes, but there is like a romantic connection between our female and male protagonists. It's also kind of a mystery. They're trying to solve these murders, but it's just got some overall really good themes. And once you get into the story, it really pulls you in, and you've got some plot twists at the end. Some crazy things happen, but it's ultimately a really good book, and I'm so excited for her to come out with the rest of the series. Could potentially be my new favorite series of all time, but we'll have to see once the next book comes out. We'll have to see. I'm gonna end with 3 YA fantasy books. So these are for young adults. I'm 28 years old and I still read YA. I love YA books. The good thing about YA fantasy books is that they don't take as much building up as adult fantasy books. In adult fantasy books, it can be kind of slow going because, I mean, I've shown you how thick some of these books are. There's a lot of world building. There's a lot of plot building, magic systems you have to build up. Just a lot of explaining, character build up. And in YA fantasy, you get more of a shortened version of that, so it's easier to read through. And in your epic high adult fantasy, you have to think a little bit more through it, and you have to remember certain things because it'll make sense when you start to put everything together. But in YA fantasy, you don't necessarily have to do that. They kind of lead you to that without too much thought process, but it's ultimately still really good. So if you like quick fantasy reads, then I would start with YA fantasy, especially if you're somebody that hasn't read fantasy before. Yeah, sorry, my cat is jumping onto this stand here. Thank you very much. Anyway, so the first one is a trilogy. Again, it's complete, so you don't have to wait for any books. This is another one of my favorite authors, and this series I think is pretty underrated. It's A Great and Terrible Beauty by Libba Bray. Libba Bray has another series, The Diviners, and a lot of people talk about that series because it's more of your paranormal, supernatural, and this is more magical, fantastical. And I don't hear a lot of people talk about this series often, but it's one of my favorite series of all time. It's one of my favorite trilogies. And it again takes place in like the 1800s. You follow a female protagonist. She's going to this boarding school in America where they teach women, you know, proper ways to dance and manners and things like that. And the whole goal is, of course, to catch a husband. But this character, she's a little bit different. That's not really what she wants. She finds out she can access this fantastical land called the Realms. And it just follows her journey. It's another good versus evil. You've got a lot of battles. You've got a lot of great characters in it. The descriptions of this different world that she's able to visit are wonderful. You've got some plot twists. It's a pretty quick read for a fantasy series, but in my opinion, it engulfs you very quickly. And this is also another rare series that has the ability to make me cry. I always cry at the end of the third one. It's got some romance in it too, but just a wholesome, good fantasy series. And it's also really funny. I like to laugh a lot in this series just because it's so funny to see the way these girls kind of rebel against this system that suppresses women. So A Great and Terrible Beauty by Libba Bray, definitely recommend for YA fantasy. The second to last YA fantasy book is a standalone. Again, with YA fantasy, sometimes it can still be difficult to find a standalone fantasy book because there's a lot of buildup that has to happen for you to get that epic pow at the end of the series that ties everything together. But this book is also relatively new. It's A Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson, sorry. This is a standalone fantasy book, and I really enjoyed it. I picked it up not expecting to love it that much because I knew it was a standalone fantasy, and typically, I find typically when I read YA standalone fantasies that I'm not really as satisfied at the end of it as I want to be, because there's not as much build up, there's not as much character development. But this book was surprisingly good. Margaret Rogerson does a great job of building up her characters and building up the plot and then tying it all together and wrapping it up at the end in such a great way. And it was so good, and I love these characters so much that I wish she would make a series out of it. I don't think she is, but this is a great standalone fantasy. It kind of centers around books and grimoires, and this girl who basically has an affinity for these books and these grimoires, and there's somebody that's trying to do something really evil with these books, and he's trying to open like a different portal to bring in this demon that's going to take over the world, and she's trying to figure out who it is and how do they stop them. And it's just a great adventure fantasy series. It's again very wholesome, but it's a great standalone YA read. I read it in, I think, one day. You get sucked in really quick, and it just wrapped up really nicely. So kudos to Margaret Rogerson, because there's not a lot of standalone YA books that I actually enjoy, and I did hers. The last book I'm going to talk about is also one that's been talked about a lot in the YA fantasy community, and that is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This book, I love this book. When I first read this book, I did not like it. The premise is super interesting. The world is super interesting. The characters are super interesting, but there's a lot of mystery, a lot of questions that come up, like, why is this world like this? Or what is this? All these questions that you have. And when I first read it, I just wanted those questions answered. You know, I'm into like quick-paced fantasy reads. I like it when they present a mystery but then immediately work towards solving it. And in my opinion, the first time I read this, it was really slow going, and it wasn't until towards the end that we got some answers, but then it also created even more questions. And Laini Taylor is such a beautiful writer, but she's also got a lot of flowery writing, and she would write a lot of descriptions of these places and these worlds and what things looked like, and just great descriptions. But when I was reading it the first time, I was like, I don't want descriptions, I just want to know what happens. So at the end of the book, I was pretty disappointed. And then I reread this book last year, and I guess because going into it, I knew what the expectation was, I was able to slowly go through it and enjoy the adventure that she takes you on and enjoy her descriptions of this world. And I picked up things that I missed the first time around because I just wanted to know answers. So I ended up really, really loving this book when I reread it. If you're somebody that's tried to read this book and put it down, I would give it another shot and just go into it with different expectations and take your time to actually enjoy the writing and enjoy the descriptions and picture in your mind this world that she is building for you. Because when you do that, you really connect with this story a lot more. It is a duology, so she does have a second book. We're gonna pretend that didn't happen. I'm not editing that out. I'm sitting on a chair that I almost fell off. Anyways, she does have a second book out that I'm currently in the process of reading right now. So I just really love this world. I really love these characters. I love her writing. Her writing is just so beautiful. So if you're going to read this series, take your time to enjoy the writing, because that's really going to build the fantastical, magical world that you want to embrace and be in. So that's it for my summer 2020 book recommendations. I hope you guys like this. I know some of these books have probably been talked about a lot before, but I fully recommend every book that I listed. They were all 5-star reads for me. So just pick one up. I like to pick up books that I maybe wouldn't normally read. So if there was anything on this list that maybe you didn't think sounded super interesting, just give it a shot. Try and read the first chapter. Sometimes, oh, this chair. Sometimes in like Barnes and Nobles or Amazon, you can read like the first few chapters of a book, but just give it a shot. The joy of reading is learning and also going to places that you don't get to go in real life. And again, this period in our lives is just unbelievable. And personally, with all the stress and the fear and anxiety, I just love to pick up a good book and forget about it for a few hours, even a few days. So please pick up some of those books. Let me know if you read a book that I recommended, and let me know if you liked it or not. You may not like it, but at least you're trying something, right? And also, I would really appreciate it if you would leave comments or subscribe or like this video. This is my first YouTube video ever. I was just recently introduced to BookTube a few months ago, and I love it. There's actually no people I personally know that read the kind of books I read, mainly fantasy, sci-fi. I don't know anybody that reads the kind of books that I read. And so I would really love to be able to talk with people that do enjoy the books I read, or that just enjoy reading in general. I'm a teacher, so mostly I'm around people that hate reading, because if you ask middle schoolers, which is what I teach, they'll tell you that they hate reading. Most of them do. So it would just be really nice to join this community and to, I'm gonna have to stand. Anyways, it would just be really nice to join this community, have people that I can talk about these books with, and to find new books that I love. Also, part of the reason I'm making this video is because I am a teacher, and there's a really good chance that next year we're going to be distance learning again, which means I'll be teaching in front of a computer again, and I'm trying to get a lot better at that. I'd like to learn more about editing and filming and making things entertaining for my students so that they actually enjoy learning. So that's kind of my thought process with this. But anyways, leave comments. I'll respond to your comments, and let me know what you guys think, or if you have any suggestions for the future. And yeah, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for joining me.